everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Workbar Live. My name is Chelsea Hildreth, the Events and Partnerships Manager at Workbar. It's our pleasure to welcome Gesche Haas, the founder and CEO of Doers. She will be presenting today on running digital communities and remote teams. To start, just a little bit about the company and Gesche. Doers is a high-impact membership community for over 30,000 women with the mission to increase the number of successful female-led ventures. Gesche Haas is an entrepreneur, investor, mentor, and advisor whose views on the tech space and beyond have been featured in Bloomberg TV, CNN Money, and the New York Times. Haas has also spoken at the United Nations 60th session for the Commission on the Status of Women. We're very lucky to have her today. Just a few notes for our guests. If you're new to Zoom webinars, it'll be best for you to have your screen on gallery mode, which you can see in the top right corner of your screen. Please feel free to ask questions during Gesche's presentation. This is gonna be a lot more conversational, so throw them in anytime you have them. You can enter these by clicking on the Q&A button or the chat button. I'll be monitoring those to make sure that we hit everyone's questions along the way. So again, Gesche, thank you for being with us today. Can you start by telling us about Doers, how it started, what it looks like today?
Yes, very honored to be here, and what crazy times we live in. It's fun because specifically in this case, like, you are a Boston-based co-working space, and our company is actually based, the HQ at least, in Jackson. So I'm really honored that we're able to have this talk. But yeah, so Dreamers and Doers started by accident out of a personal need about 6 years ago. And I myself had a background as an investor at a hedge fund. I had worked at several venture-backed startups, and it's just really hard starting a company from scratch, no matter what kind of background you've had before. So very organically, as I was working on a company, my first company, I myself needed a network, and organically started meeting other entrepreneurs at that time. And now for me, because I'm surrounded by a lot of female entrepreneurs every single day, but at the time it was very hard to imagine. And running Workbar, I understand too, like, having a community is so important, but a lot of my friends and family at the time could not relate to my life decisions, why I gave up so much of my life to work on my company. So it was this existential need for me to find other like-minded individuals. So it was something that I worked on the side, and always thought it would never be a business. Everyone was like, why don't you make this your full-time company? And I was like, no, it's a community. It's not a business. And lo and behold, a year into working on this on the side, it had taken off so much that I either had to stop working on it because I didn't have the resources to spend the time on it, or I had to go all in. And that's when I decided to go all in. So a very happy accident that has become the biggest part of my life right now. And awesome. In terms of what it is today, we have two parts to the community. One is our wider entrepreneurial ecosystem that has over 30,000 women. And a large part of that is women hiring each other. And actually anyone on this call who wanted to join, who is a woman right now, it's focused on women, could join. It's a free resource we provide. And then we also have our collective, our private collective, which is very, very curated, where the application itself is by invitation. And we say that it's for what we call extraordinary entrepreneurial women. So it could be what in a traditional sense is a female founder, or anyone operating in an entrepreneurial environment. So it could be someone senior at a startup, someone who works at a corporation in an innovation role, an investor. So basically any woman that doesn't have a very regular 9-to-5 and who could benefit from a strong support system around them. And what we do is, one part, we connect these amazing women to each other and make them more successful because of that. And we ourselves provide added resources. So a big part is visibility that we provide. So we have columns with publications such as Business Insider and others. And our thesis there is that even if women are underrepresented in certain leadership roles or in entrepreneurship, by giving them more visibility, that's a huge part in changing the dynamic and increasing the number of successful ventures launched. And what we like saying in terms of like our thesis and our values is we turn mutual support into a competitive edge.
Okay, awesome. Well, that's great. And I'm sure that we'll have some attendees and viewers today that'll be reaching out to you. So moving into our topic today, can you start by telling us about starting and running a digital company? What does it entail? What's a digital community?
Absolutely. And in our case, we were on the end of our community was always digital first. And I think when you start a community, it's really important to know where is the main area where they will engage in. In this day and age, like there's no community that doesn't at least have some online component. But knowing like what you want your primary focus to be is really important, because it allows you to do an exceptional job at where you want to be doing an exceptional job. So in our case, we focus on online, partially because it is female and female founder focused. So by definition, it's a very quote unquote busy audience, right? We're trying to do the impossible. We're creating something out of nothing. And in addition, we happen to be women. And sometimes there are additional hurdles that are there. And then if in addition to that, you're also a parent, like there's just a lot that comes into it. So in our case, we decided that online was the right path, because it brings a lot of efficiency with it. And our community does have occasional offline events in our major hubs, which are New York, San Francisco, and LA. But I'd say 90% of the activity happens online. And then it was a pretty conscious decision as well to run the company in a remote manner. And it took a bit of trial and error to figure out what the right fit was, but then eventually remote was the right fit for us.
Yeah, makes sense. So, okay, so tell us a little bit more about the business. I know you just went into some details, but how do you monetize, and what does the team look like pre-COVID and during COVID, and hopefully what it'll look like after?
Absolutely. And I think this is an interesting angle too, because we started out by accident and we're like, oh, hey, we're building this and clearly this has value. But obviously, because it was an accident, we didn't start out charging. And to add to that, like, I think as a community builder, especially, it can be hard to sometimes monetize, because the majority of community builders, I'd say, are like naturally drawn to supporting others, helping others. And then when you're creating something of value, sometimes it is hard to then start turning around and charging for it. So realizing that you can actually create much more value if you do charge is, I think, something that's more important to mention for community builders than for business builders who maybe don't have a community attached to that. So just realizing that as a first step. In terms of the model, in our case, there was a few specific ones we considered. One was a membership model. Another one we, for a short time, explored was like, do we want to run this as a nonprofit? And that last part was as a partnership. Nonprofit, we quickly decided we didn't want to do. And the reason was because our core audience are business owners, and we wanted the infrastructure to represent what our members represented. Partnership, working with corporations in terms of sponsorships, is something we thought was interesting. But our thesis was that we wanted to provide the biggest value possible to our members. And the moment our biggest stakeholders became corporate partners, we were worried that we would be more responsible to them than to our members. So what we did was we started out with a membership model. Mm-hmm. And another factor there too is that we have a subscription. So it's not like a one-time membership, it's an ongoing membership. And we figured that this would ensure that we are sustainable, that we have a longer runway, but also that we're providing something of value, right? Like in our case, like I dropped everything else in my life to work on this, and it's easy to say like, hey, I want this to exist, and this is helping me so much. But there's a difference between individuals investing financially and being truly committed. And free doesn't equal free. So there's, and we'll get to this, I'm sure, but there's a lot of free communities out there as well. And but sometimes you don't get as good of an experience if it's free, because you aren't as committed, you don't get as high quality of resources. So being able to provide something that is of added value, that saves our members time and has a bigger impact. So we started out with the paid membership, and we did add partnerships for some time, because the moment you have a paid membership, your audience also becomes more valuable and more appealing to partners. We only temporarily did partnerships, because I think one thing that people don't talk about enough is like, to do it really, really well, there's a lot of infrastructure needed. Like you ideally need multiple full-time people to source partnerships and to maintain them, if you're looking at like bigger partnerships. So it's something that we currently aren't doing, but we will be re-exploring in the future.
Okay, awesome. And what are the other, you touched on some, but what are other additional models of monetization that a community builder can consider? I know you said free doesn't always mean free, just because maybe the paid membership is not every route that people want to take. What are some other
Absolutely. And I think the major part that I didn't mention is One is like a freemium model, and the second part is a combination. And I think communities are especially, it happens much more frequently for communities that you have a mix of business models, just given the nature of a community and what it represents in terms of having an engaged audience and providing value to them. So in terms of having a freemium model, other ways to monetize are, let's say, depending on the nature of your community, you have a jobs platform. So we have one that we currently aren't monetizing, but you could build a wider audience, and maybe the individuals that are able to find jobs don't pay, but maybe the people who post jobs, they pay. Or let's say you have a newsletter. So then obviously the audience who receives the newsletter, they don't pay, but maybe people might want to put in ads in your newsletter, or you might have sponsored posts. And I think so determining what the right model is for you specifically depends on who's your audience, right? Is this an audience that is business focused? Is it an audience that's more lifestyle focused? And that will determine how to monetize in terms of, like, do you charge your members? Do you charge partners? And it also depends on like how sticky your community is as well. And you might have different sizes. You might have a community that's very small but very, very engaged. In that case, maybe a membership model makes more sense. Or you might have an audience that's very, very big and maybe not engaged enough to be able to charge them, but maybe engaged enough to be very appealing to a sponsor.
Okay, awesome. That was one of the questions I was going to ask. And then how do you ensure, as a community grows, that the model that that you currently have is adaptable to a growing community? So say going from 10,000 to 30,000.
Yes.
How does it
I think one part that isn't talked about nearly enough is the operations that goes into running a community, and frankly, any type of company. And in our case, because we started out by accident, we had to figure out a lot after the fact. And I would also say in many ways, we were pretty early on. So even just charging a membership was a bigger struggle, I think, for me emotionally, like wrapping my head around it, because a lot of people weren't doing it at the time. Now it's a lot more common, and it's a lot less of a question a founder would ask themselves. So it's the operations. There's a lot more platforms that are developed that are helpful. For example, there's a platform called Mighty Networks that is female founded and fantastic. And actually, one more business model I didn't mention is courses, education. And Mighty Networks actually has a great system to monetize it. But until these platforms came out, there was a lot of like patchwork that needed to be done. Where like, oh, your community lives in a Facebook group, then the course lives here, and then you charge here. And also on our end, we currently have a patchwork that we're very painfully improving. But in terms of like scale that you asked about, I think it's really important to think about the infrastructure that you want, so that it doesn't cause a lot of friction. Doing it earlier is better. And I'd also say your business model evolves. So in most cases, I wouldn't recommend starting out with a business model from day one, right? Because with any company and any community, there's a lot of trial and error where you're like, who is my community? What do they actually want? And providing value. It's hard to say like, hey, pay me this or pay for this ad, but you don't actually have anyone in your community yet. So number one, before you even start about charging, is like figuring out what is your value proposition and making sure that the thesis that you have works. But it is very helpful to have the thesis in place in terms of how you want to monetize, and that will set you up for way more success.
Awesome. So like, as you mentioned, building communities is difficult. Charging for those communities can be even more difficult, and figuring it out, as you mentioned, trial and error. But how have you been able to deliver the value you have? And what can others learn from you who are looking to build their own communities? Like, what value have you been giving to these communities that is worth the membership charge?
Yes, that's a fantastic question. And I think it's thinking about like, what are communities, and also what's the difference between a community and an audience. And the strongest communities are those that do have some strong leadership in place, and also where there's enough common ground among the community members. So one part is making sure that the type of community you're starting is something that is needed, right? Like if you're starting a community for people who drink water, there are a lot of people who drink water, but do they necessarily feel strongly enough to want to ban forces, right? Like, so it's one thing that's I found a helpful framework is the strongest communities, the community members have to have a common pain point. And generally, the more common the pain point is, and the more, in some ways, like rare it is, sometimes that helps with stronger bonds. So in our case, it's founders. Founders do very difficult things in most cases, and female founders, there's more difficulties beyond that. So that's one strong pain point that combines us. Or so that's one part, like what community are you creating? And then the second part is curation. So if there is not strong leadership and anyone can join, that in most cases strongly dilutes the community and dilutes the value, because then it basically blurs the line between this distinguished community and others. So being really clear on who is a good fit and who isn't, and then providing resources that are very specific to that audience. And the beauty of communities is that as a community leader, you get scale in many ways. So by aggregating individuals together and by putting resources in place, you can make the pie bigger for everyone involved, right? Like the sum, the whole is bigger than the sum of all parts, where if our individual members were to all go out and try to get press themselves, try to get speaking opportunities, try to, get access to mentors, try to find these individuals that can help their very specific problem, it would take them 10 times longer. So by figuring out what are their specific pain points and having a community that has enough common pain points, and then investing our resources in a way to help them is what in our case has really worked. But I'd say this is a framework that works for nearly all communities.
Awesome. Okay, great. Well, I just want to remind everyone now, if you have questions for Gesche, to start, putting them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them. But
also, I realized I didn't answer one of your questions. I think you asked me about the team pre and post COVID.
Yes.
So I can dive into that.
I missed that too. Pre, post, hopefully what it'll look like after.
Yes. So in our case, I was based in New York for 12 years. And I recently moved to Wyoming about 2 years ago. I think it's important to mention that because, as a founder, in many ways, it's exciting to be a founder. You have a lot of freedom, but you also have a lot of pressure because there are so many decisions you need to make, and frankly, the decisions have such a huge impact on your company, but also on your life. And I don't nearly hear founders talk about that enough. And it's important in terms of the success of the company, but also, I don't necessarily think running a company that's quote unquote successful on paper is something to aim for if it doesn't translate into a life that you actually want to lead, right? So in my case, I initially built a team that was mostly in New York, and we also experimented with full-time team members. But we then team-wise pivoted to is fully remote and only part-time. And what it has afforded us is that we're able to hire experts in certain areas, especially if you're an early stage company. There's so many things that need to get done, and it's hard. I find it harder to hire individuals full-time that then are an expert in 5 different areas.
Right.
And to be fully honest, pre-COVID, sometimes I was more often self-conscious about we don't have an office, we don't have a huge full-time staff. But now in hindsight, now post-COVID, when you see a lot of companies very sadly having to shutter doors because of that, it seems to have worked in this current environment. And I think there's no way to know what what company to build in terms of what the future environment might be, because it can always evolve. And I think it reminds us that you have to build what's right for you, because the environment could always change so significantly that it's much easier to weather the storms if you've built something that made logical sense to you and to your company and also to your personal life. In our case, the team hasn't changed as much. We just given that we were already fully remote, but we're a team of about 8 people, and all over the States, and in some cases abroad as well.
Okay, awesome. I want to circle back to running that remote team, but we do have a couple questions here. This one's kind of a multi-part one. So making the change from free to paid, so going back to the monetization, can often get touchy or have pushback. Looking for advice in this realm.
Absolutely. And I love recognizing that it's hard, because I think that's the first step to approaching it in the right way. So one thing we realized is like, we're not forcing anyone to sign up for a paid membership, but we will provide them with enough value and give them the option to do so. And so figuring out that this is an opportunity for both the consumer as well as for the company to see like, where is the value. And in terms of actual practical action steps, what we did, because we started out as free, is we made it optional. So we said like, this is what we offer, and if you want to sign up for it, this is what you'll get. But you also obviously don't have to sign up. And then there'll be like some free offerings, which in our case is the jobs group. And then it was a really clear segmentation. And then once you start with the paid part and you have your initial core, then I think the people that you attract from there onwards, because there's no question about like, is this free, isn't this free? But it's just like, this is what it costs, like, this is what we have to offer. It becomes much, once you've made the switch, it's much more organic. So the hardest part for sure is making that switch and explaining it. But what I'll also say is, I feel like most community builders are highly empathetic, and we really absorb other people's opinions. And oftentimes the people that were like the loudest about like, oh, you know, like we'd ask people like, how much would you pay? And someone would be like, maybe $1, right? And these people obviously aren't part of the paid community now. And it's just like not giving as much attention to those voices, which is very easy to do. So I think just like trying to take the emotion out as much as possible, and just setting that structure up and giving people the option, and also not reading too much into, if not everyone signs up, it's fine. Like there will be a new batch of individuals that will translate later.
Okay. And then kind of segueing into something that you mentioned about paid advertising during, and then relating it to COVID. So they would like to know, right now it feels like a lot of content is coming out for free and burying the paid content. What's your advice for starting paid content now in the midst of COVID? And, you know, I would assume that'd be part of like a long-term plan as we wean out of this.
So for us, it was interesting because we were already online. So we didn't change that much, but because everyone else became online, it impacted us in the sense that like, oh, there's just like such a sea of content.
Right.
So we'll cover briefly like what we did, and then specifically what others can do. So on our end, we're focusing on less is more. So rather than having like all this content to choose from, we're doing fewer, and then we're investing more in making each one of them really amazing, and also trying to make them feel more like offline events. So rather than having like a Zoom registration, we have it on Splash that. And then we try to build in different aspects that build in accountability so that people actually show up. Then in terms of launching anything paid, I think it's similar to a community where it's a bit tricky. Like if you're launching for the first time, it's hard to start out and be like, hey, this is my content and this is the cost. There does have to be either a community already in place, or there needs to be like initial content that is a teaser that is potentially pro bono. So how to do that? It could be like, let's say you are offering a course that is 8 hours. Then maybe you would want to offer something that's half an hour and that's free, just to get people kind of to show them the value that you have. Or you could start a newsletter and build an audience and give them tidbits. But basically you need to have an audience in place that sees the value for them to start paying. But I think there's absolutely value in that. If you think about Masterclass, the startup that provides content, like in many ways, it's like a documentary, but just like much more supercharged, right? And they charge a decent amount of money, and they seem to be making quite a lot of money, and have raised a lot of venture funding. But I think there's absolutely value in the current environment, but it will have to be differentiated in the sense of like really high quality and really thoughtful. And so other ways of doing it, other than like in the production, is just making sure that maybe you build a community around it, or you as the founder or provider of the content make yourself available after for Q&A, or you provide other things that are higher touch, because people all have fatigue these days from all this like low quality content, or just like content that's thrown at them. So even just like how you communicate and deliver the content and distribute it will make a difference in terms of being able to charge.
Okay, great. And then another question before we move on to remote teams, we're still going to get there. What do you look for in a partner? How do you evaluate them? Like, what's your system?
Partner in terms of sponsorships.
Yes, I believe that's what they're asking.
Absolutely. So depending on what your community is, you want to be more careful than in other circumstances, because we are so highly curated and so value driven. There are certain communities that that are very, let's say, the startup that's very known to be sexist, right? It wouldn't be a great partner for us. So one part is like making sure that it doesn't harm you in terms of your brand equity. Then assuming you've checked that off, then it also depends on like what the partnership looks like. And my personal thesis there is like, you ideally want to look for partners that support initiatives that you would have done anyhow, right? Like if this partner comes to you and says like, hey, I want you to launch a chapter in this city, or I want you to do all these like things that technically you could do, but that weren't part of your core strategy, sometimes it can end up being more costly than not. And I do think like making sure that it's the right time for you to partner is helpful, making sure that whatever they provide hopefully is an additional benefit to your audience. And I think another trick that wasn't specifically asked, but like, so one is what was asked was how do you evaluate them, but how do you find partners? And I think it's looking at like if you go to meetup.com, I mean, now they're not as active, but like just looking at what are certain brands that are very commonly sponsoring. And they're just certain like go-to companies that have a very big budget where it's just very much part of their core operation. So I think like sometimes the hardest part is identifying the right partners. And then also understanding like which ones are the ones that provide financial sponsorship versus in-kind. And just making sure that you invest your time really well, because it can be a huge time suck.
Yeah, I hear you. Okay, so moving back to, running a remote team and team building and all of that. In terms of team building, how did you set up your remote team? Give us some of the most important learning lessons that you've had over the years. I know you've talked about trial and error, but what are some of the do's and don'ts that you've learned?
The most important part is setting it up in the DNA of your company from the beginning, right? So, and I think especially in this day and age, and we had this call like 3 months ago, this conversation might be different, but I think we realize like some people love working from home. They love working remote. They love the freedom. And some people like, they get really lonely, depressed. I mean, we all do at some points, but like, it's just a better structure for some people than for others. So one, setting up your infrastructure in a way where like, hey, like we on purpose decided to make the community itself a bit more online than offline on purpose, because we knew this would help with having a remote team. Then whenever we talk to individuals, people that have had experience working remote, because if you have not actually done it, you don't know what it's like. And right. It's so costly when you onboard someone and then after like 3 months realize it isn't a fit. So I generally lean towards people who've done it before. And same with like part-time. Like for us, the part-time model works so well. And we've had people that were otherwise full-time that were taking breaks in between jobs. And they're like, sure, I'll do part-time work. And after 3 months, they're like, no, you know what, I want to go back to full-time. So I think just curating that from the beginning is super important. And it's easier, I think, when you're a remote team to forget about company culture. But not doing that is crucial and seems obvious. But so one thing we do is like we have once a month at least, we have a whole team call and we talk about everything but work. So we'll a different team member will come up with some intriguing questions. So we know a lot of personal things about each other, but it's just like the culture of our company. And right. One thing we emphasize is like learning about each other's dreams outside of the company and how we can support each other in achieving that. And that makes people way more loyal and excited about working at the company because they're more than just the identity within the work that they do.
Awesome. And what about the members? I mean, we've talked a lot about, starting a business and working for one and being a remote team member, but what about the members? What's the benefits? I know what yours is specifically, but what are general advantages of joining a digital community, and what
Yes.
should potential members, say me, look for, because there's
Yes.
a lot to choose from out there.
Yes. And I think like for digital, for online or for offline communities, it's so important to dive deep into like what you actually want so that you spend your resources and your time really, really well. So in our case, even though we're focused on entrepreneurial women, we're not the right fit for all entrepreneurial women. So let's say someone really all they want is like new business. Then we are a terrible fit for them because we have guidelines in place and where members are actually not allowed to like proactively sell. But then a community like BNI, which usually is offline, and I'm sure they're comparable ones online, could be a great fit. That's really like a referral network. So knowing what you want is number one. Then number two is realizing, like with everything, like what you see on the outside might be very different than what you see in the inside. So some communities that have like great branding, great everything, like that don't have as much of a value within the community. So especially if it's a community that is a higher ticketed amount to join, I would see if they can connect you with an existing member, and that will be, even if they will connect you or if they don't connect you, is a good initial sign, and then that conversation itself will be very telling as well.
Right. No, that's very helpful. And taking a different angle, tell us about the decisions on how to run your company have impacted your life outside of work. Like, would
Yes.
you said this happened by accident, but has it been for the
Yes,
better?
and I wish I learned this lesson way, way sooner. It's so easy to, when you start out, you're like, oh, what should I be doing? And what's everyone else doing? And initially we were building out our own tech platform. We had a CTO, we're interviewing with accelerators, and it wasn't the right fit for us
Mm.
and the why for our company. So in my case, having lived in New York for over a decade, I then realized like I might not want to live in New York forever. And being a female founder, like it's harder to separate personal and professional life. Like if I ever want to have children, it has to be part of my work planning. And I did become a mom 9 months ago, and I'm actually pregnant again. But so I feel more lucky than I ever have to have structured the company the way I have. I care so much about work. I love my baby, but I couldn't give up work for the baby. It's my decision, right? Like everyone's different, but because I structured the company the way I did, I'm able to really commit to work as well as be a mother by being remote. So in my case, I would make the decisions I did again. But I will also say like it's personal, but B, also there are downsides. Like even though there's so much that I appreciate about the path that I took, there's things that are hard. Like people will ask me like, oh, how is your project doing? Like, are you doing this full time? And it's more than full time for me, but because we intentionally didn't raise venture funding, because we intentionally didn't, because we intentionally don't do like a lot of advertising outside, there's certain maybe friction points that come about, but I embrace them, right? Like I know a lot of companies that intentionally are a lot more visible on the outside that ended up imploding, right? Like I cared more about building a solid company, working with people I care about, having a sustainable business model. But some cases you don't have that option. Some cases you do have to grow quicker. Some cases you do have to take bigger risks. And yeah, so everything has their pros and cons. So just making sure it works for you.
Okay, great. And someone would like to know, how do you monitor or censor the conversations of the community to ensure you don't get unwanted information or conflicts between your members? I think that's very interesting.
It's a fantastic question, and clearly from someone who has experience themselves building a community. So we're lucky that we have two parts. So one part is our in the very highly curated paid community, there's a little bit less of a risk of seeing these conversations just because it's smaller and it's curated, but it still takes quite a bit of work because we aim at a really extremely high quality. So we have team members in place that help with that. Then we have approved posts for certain groups that are more closely monitored, that have higher standards. In addition to that, we have a group of over 30,000 women with the jobs platform. And there we leverage a lot of the infrastructure where there's approved posts. And now that group currently lives on Facebook, and Facebook has added a lot of elements where you can set up keywords that are alerted. Then we've also set up certain guidelines in terms of like we limit a little bit of what you can post, which also helps. But the more flexibility you have, it can be a benefit in a sense that like it's a more exciting group, but there are drawbacks. But I'd say like just making sure that you have the infrastructure in place. And these days, so many platforms have ways to monitor just because there are sadly a lot of bad actors on the internet. And it just takes a small number of bad actors to really mess it up for a lot of people. But yeah, I'd leverage the infrastructure in place, or make sure that the platform you pick has the infrastructure in place if you're planning on launching something really big.
Okay, great. And someone would also like to know what your opinion is on the speed of implementation versus doing it right, i.e. they're working on a project, nervous about doing it right the first time, but they don't want to allow the time for someone else to take that concept and beat them to the punch on it.
Yes, I think it really it depends on what exactly it is, but I'll say sometimes some people do things so quickly and then they aren't around anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a healthy mix of both, but there's also ways to hack it, right? Like if the goal is to like get your name out first, like depending on what it is, like you could start a Kickstarter, right? Like you can, with a Kickstarter, you can get a lot of like press and you can get a lot of distribution and you can have people prepay memberships, depending if that's the model. And even though you don't have anything launched yet, so they know like, oh, it's not out yet, this is still coming, but you already have thousands of people on your, paying members technically. So that's one way to hack it. Or another way to hack it would be like, hey, you launch this like newsletter that's a precursor. So if you're working on something where it's really important to be first in the market, there are ways to kind of capture that audience without having the product quite there yet.
Awesome. Okay, so while everybody types in kind of their last questions for you, I thought you could give us, the 3 or 4 biggest takeaways that, throughout this conversation that you want all of us to have.
Yes. So number one, and I've said this a few times, but it's so important, is really digging into why you're doing what you're doing. And like, I'd rather fail at something I love than succeed at something I hate. So like spending some time on that and doing that on an ongoing basis, because that will change a lot. So doing what's right for you, doing what's right for your company, it makes logical sense. The second part is with communities that we actually didn't talk about enough quite yet, is a measure of success for a community is the connections among your community members. So the difference between a community and an audience is that an audience is one to many. Like you could have an audience of 1 million people and put out content, and your audience members may never ever interact with each other. And for a community, what makes a community really strong are the interactions among community members. So if you have an online community, if you have an offline community, looking at those connections among your community members is a great way to see how you're doing and how sustainable this will be. Because even if you're not active for a week, your community still lives by those connections.
Right.
So being thoughtful about the container you set up and how you communicate with everyone, and how you evolve from there will have like it's hard to do. Building communities is very, very hard, but if you do it right, it's so worthwhile.
Awesome. Okay, and I think we have one final question for you. What kind of partner haven't you been able to find? What's missing, or what are you seeking?
Yes. I mean, we haven't been super proactive about it, but we're probably like the latest end of the year. I mean, our dream partner would be someone who is focused on women and who ideally has similar values. So it's not just profits, but like truly making a difference. And a partner where by partnering, they're obviously better off, but also it would be a significant boost to our members. So it could be, let's say, a major publication that really wants to bring the word out on female founders. That would be interesting. Or, a company that's like body positive, that again wants to tell the stories of women and really, and can benefit from the incredible stories that we have. Because a big part of what we do is actually real talk within our community, by having like the safe space. So basically having a company that's aligned with values, where we can benefit them and they can benefit us quite organically. And there's a few that come in mind, but it's such a big process to make happen. So it's less about finding the companies, but about putting all the infrastructure in place that is needed to do it well and do it right. Yeah.
And one more person wants to know, what have you found to be the best platforms for communities to communicate and collaborate? kind of to your last point
Yes.
about engagement,
Yes.
and what is the cost associated with leveraging
Yes.
the platforms that you use?
Absolutely. So I think, I mean, Facebook, there's a lot of negative things about it, but if you're trying to build a community and build it pretty quickly, Facebook is sometimes great to start out with because of the built-in audience. So to give an example, we as a team, I spent 99.9% of my time on our paid community. But it is our unpaid community that's grown to 30,000 people nearly organically. And a large part there is, it would have never happened if we weren't on Facebook with that group, right? Because people find out about it, people are able to add each other. The drawbacks are that it's like for the jobs platform, we can't, people can't search by location. It just doesn't scale as much. The quality isn't there as we'd like it to be. But I don't want to discount Facebook for something that involves setting something up really quickly, setting something up that people are used to, don't have a learning curve, that you want people to actually use, and you want that to be built and grow. If you want something quote unquote more sophisticated, and maybe you have an existing audience and you just want to deliver like sophisticated infrastructure, the next one I'd recommend is Mighty Networks. They have a free version. Then they have a version, I think that it's up to like $40 a month, and then one that's $80 a month, that are pretty sophisticated. They have great courses, infrastructure built in. Then they have a white label that is, in my mind, a little bit, it's 30,000 per year. And literally the only difference, it's all the same features, but then you get a white label. You have an app that doesn't say Mighty Networks and it has your own company. And so I personally don't think that the value is entirely there, but that's the next one I'd recommend.
Okay, awesome. Okay, well, I think that is good with all of the questions. I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I know I'm personally thankful to have connected with you, and I can tell by the questions that people are looking forward to potentially connecting with you as well. So for our attendees, we will be sending a follow-up survey. It'll have links to Gesche's information, like her website and her LinkedIn and things like that. Definitely check her out and her business. And thank you for attending with us today, Gesche. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
hopefully we'll be in touch soon. And guys, feel free to reach out to Gesche, okay? And thanks again for everyone for joining.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.